Today we're going to talk about motorsport in Texas. When you think about motorsport in America, you're probably thinking North Carolina with NASCAR, Indianapolis for IndyCar. And Texas has always had this kind of strange relationship. We've always been part of the racing world. We've never really been a hub of motorsport, though. But you can tell clearly we're growing, we're evolving. Formula One chose Austin as its home when it wanted to come to the United States and build a permanent racing circuit. We have Texas Motor Speedway. As far as oval tracks go, we've got NHRA drag strips. But I really want to focus on some individuals, because those individuals are really the ones who make Texas and motorsport what it is. These are going to be some of our lone stars of speed. Before we get too far, I'll introduce myself, even though I think probably you guys know who I am. I'm Elizabeth Blackstock, an award-winning motorsport podcaster, historian, journalist, etc. I grew up in Michigan, born and raised, but I did come down to Texas. My mom met a guy here, and so I started to come visit every so often, which was really lovely, and I realized when I wanted to kind of grow up and get older, that's perfect, thank you, ma'am. When I wanted to forge my life, I wanted to come down to Texas. So started going to college here and then have just never left. I've worked at a variety of publications like Planet F1, Road and Track, The Road Rat, etc. And one of my favorite topics to talk about when it comes to motorsport is how every little individual region has developed its own traditions and histories. And I really want to dig into the Texas ones because I think it's phenomenal. As I said, you have the hubs for racing. Texas has not traditionally been one of them. And the big reason for that is because Texas is a big state, and we never really had things like moonshine running that encouraged the NASCAR scene to coalesce around a specific area. We didn't have the auto industry down here that encouraged the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We didn't have the aerospace industry in California that caused hot rodding and sports car racing to explode there. But we have had a lot of enterprising individuals who have come and really taken motorsport by the horns and left it better than they found it. And one of the first ones I want to talk about today is a man from Tyler, Texas. He's known as Rajo Jack. That's the name he raced under, but he was born Dewey Gatson. He was a direct descendant of slaves, born in 1905. And he didn't see a vehicle with his own two eyes, at least as far as automobiles went, until he was an older child and the Ringling Brothers Circus came to town. His dad, Noah, was really big in the railroad industry. He's kind of a general fix-it man with the railroads around Tyler, Texas. And so Rajo Jack was getting early hands-on experience with machinery and mechanics. So the family did end up moving to California while Rajo Jack was fairly young, still in his teen years, but fairly young. And when he was there, he took on a job as a kind of general laborer and fix-it man for effectively a snake oil salesman who scammed a lot of people and tried to run around California, because this was prior to there ever really being, a way to figure that out. But Dewey Gatson, Rajo Jack, he started to work on the cars for this guy. And then this guy would put him in race cars and put him on the racetrack to promote his latest elixir. Rajo gets a job selling Rajo headers, so cylinder heads for his cars. And the best way to promote that is by racing. Changes his name, takes on the name Rajo Jack, pronounced differently than the headers actually were, but uses his success behind the wheel as a way to promote the product he's selling. It works, but he also falls in love with motorsport. So in the 20s and 30s, he was a huge aspect of the California racing scene, winning a lot of races. But as you probably know, the Indy 500 at this point in time is the pinnacle of motorsport. Everyone wants to race at Indy, and so did Rajo Jack. The problem was that racing was sanctioned by an organization called the AAA. Same AAA that exists today, but back in the day, it used to also sanction motorsport. That was a way that they felt that general automobiling could gain more visibility, to gain more legitimacy. So AAA it sanctions the Indy 500. And to compete in the Indy 500, you needed to have a AAA racing license. To get a AAA racing license, you could not race in any form of motorsport that was not AAA sanctioned. If you had a AAA racing license and you competed in a race that was not AAA sanctioned, you were considered an outlaw and you were banned from competing in AAA. If you wanted a AAA racing license, but you were racing in these outlaw circuits, you had to cease immediately. But if you were Rajo Jack, the outlaw racing scene was all you had, because the AAA didn't award licenses to black men. There was no official rule that banned black men. There was only one black man, though, to ever be awarded a license, and that was boxer Jack Johnson. He and Barney Oldfield wanted to do a match race together, and when the AAA realized that Jack Johnson was, in fact, the Jack Johnson, and that he was a black man, they revoked his racing license. So you have this double bind here. Nothing in the official AAA rules actually said no black people are allowed. However, so it opened this belief that, like, maybe if I'm good enough, I can be the one to break through. Maybe someone somewhere could see your potential and say, I can look past your race and give you this license. The problem, again, you have to convince a lot of people about this. So if you manage to convince and get your racing license, when you turn up to the track, the AAA official at that race has to accept you as well. If you show up and he decides that a black man does not need to race, he can take your license. Rajo Jack never got a license. He was left competing in these outlaw races. He was extremely successful at them. And he did try to find a way around this, particularly in his early racing career. He claimed to be Portuguese, and then he claimed to be Native American. Neither of those really worked. He was a lighter-skinned black man, but he was still a black man. They were also not a fan of letting Native Americans or Portuguese race, so it didn't really help anyway. But he was just like a hugely successful racer at this point in time. And, for anyone, not just for a black man. He would never realize his dream of competing at Indianapolis. In 1940, he had a major crash where he had a broken arm, a fractured skull, and a severe concussion. The ambulance drivers refused to transport a black man to the hospital, so he was left waiting until one of the rival team owners decided to put him in the back of his pickup truck and drive him to the hospital. His arm never healed properly, and they believed that he was left with some sort of cognitive issues after that concussion. And then the war came, World War II. Rajo Jack was barred from the military, even though he did want to join. Because of the broken arm, he was never able to fully extend it anymore. But he was still determined. 1945, race ends, he's back out there competing. He's 40 years old, and he's still determined. He keeps on going, less often because he doesn't quite have much money and he is still unwell, through to 1955. At this point, he believes he has a chance at Indianapolis because the AAA stopped sanctioning the Indy 500 and it opened the door for a new organization, USAC, to come in. He thought there's no ban from USAC on people of color, maybe there's a chance. But 1 year later, before USAC ever sanctioned its first race for Indy, Rajo Jack pulled over to the side of a road during a road trip with his brother, complaining of chest pain. By the time his brother got him to the hospital, he was dead. So even though Rajo Jack did spend the bulk of his career outside of Texas, he still remains one of this state's trailblazers in so many ways. His competitors respected him deeply, even if he was not able to compete kind of in the proper non-outlaw series. They would make a point of traveling with him when they went to races up and down the West Coast to make sure that he would be safe from harassment. And motorsport continues to be largely a white man's sport, but Rajo Jack paved the way for some of the most incredible black racers we've seen. Wendell Scott shortly after in NASCAR, Willie T. Ribbs here in the United States in the Indy 500 and Trans Am, and in some ways even Lewis Hamilton, allowing that kind of legacy to continue. But that brings us now to probably one of the biggest legends of the Lone Star State, Carroll Shelby. He was born in Leesburg, Texas in 1923, and if you're a car fan, you know him from his Shelby Automotive Company. If you're a movie aficionado, you saw him portrayed by Matt Damon in 2019's Ford versus Ferrari. And his life story has been inspiring Texans for decades, and there are two big things to know about a young Carroll Shelby. First is that he grew up with a love of speed, and second, he was born with heart valve leakage problems. The speed aspect was something that he was able to satisfy by riding his bike to dirt tracks around Dallas when he was a kid, and then driving and caring for his father's cars. He became a flight instructor in World War II and spent a few years after the war trying to figure out exactly what it was he wanted to do with his life. So in 1952, a friend invites him to a race, and Shelby realizes, this is my thing. I can do this. He later joined an event at the end of that year, won 4 of the races held during that event. By 1954, he was international. He competed first in Argentina, then headed to England and Italy for a few different events, came back to America to set some speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats, got injured in Mexico's grueling Carrera Panamericana race, underwent 8 months of operations, then got back behind the wheel and continued racing. In 1958 and 59, Shelby competed in a handful of Formula One races, albeit without much success, and he and a teammate, Roy Salvadori, also took home the overall win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1959. Unfortunately, Shelby's heart problems had plagued him his whole life, and at this point, he had to stop racing. It was no longer safe for him to do so. It wasn't safe for him, it wasn't safe for his competitors should something happen on the track. But his influence on the racing world never slowed down because he never left the racing world. He established his own Shelby car company in Dallas so that you could import European cars to the United States. He moved to California, established the Shelby American Car Company, and he also built a racing school out in California, so he was starting to establish his presence there. You really cannot overstate how important Shelby American was to the American automotive racing scene. Sports car racing, it's been a big deal in Europe for years and years and years in the 1960s. There's decades of this experience over there. But in the United States, we didn't have the same kinds of roads. Our racing was banned pretty early on public streets, so road racing and sports car racing here, not as fruitful. In Europe, and particularly in England, there was a unique philosophy with racing as well. That was competing in lightweight, nimble cars. You didn't need a big engine if you were driving something that could move easily. In America, we loved our big engines, and we had the belief that a big engine necessitated a big, heavy car to go with it. Shelby had seen both of those philosophies and realized the pros and cons of them, and decided with his Shelby American company, specifically the Shelby AC Cobra, that he was going to combine a lightweight chassis that you can see here, this is a British car, with a big American V8 engine. So he had solved effectively the problems of both of these philosophies. He had the speed and the power, and he also had the maneuverability. These cars were transformative. As soon as he started producing them in bulk, they were winning races around the world, and Shelby became the first American manufacturer to win the FIA World Sports Car Championship overall in 1965. Now, Shelby had been using Ford V8 engines in his Cobras, which kicked off a long-standing relationship with Ford. The two organizations agreed to partner up with Shelby to use that same lightweight chassis, big engine formula to create the Shelby Mustang. And when that worked, and it was so successful, Ford said, "We'd like you to take on the challenge of beating Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans." The car that resulted from this partnership is the iconic Ford GT40. Ford had built a version of this car already, but it was a disaster, to put it politely. Shelby and his team of engineers, designers, and racers took that car and honed it into the machine that was able to take down Ferrari at the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. That was one of the big pinnacles of Shelby's career, but it was by no means the last. He would go back to Le Mans the next year, win the whole thing again. He was active in motorsport for the rest of his life. He kicked off partnerships with Dodge, built his own cars, returned to Ford. He helped other one-off projects get off the ground. He helped American racer Dan Gurney start his All-American Racers team. And when he died at the age of 89 in 2012, Carroll Shelby was a legend. The race cars he designed set the benchmark for every single form of racing moving forward because he had seen the logic in two differing sides of racing philosophies and applied them to a single racing car. Obviously, you need a car that is powerful and fast, it just can't also be bulky, kind of ruins the whole point. Shelby didn't necessarily invent the concept of aerodynamics or the concept of speed, but he did refine a lot of the earliest applications of those to prove that they could be successful. And with that institutional support from Ford, he was able to set a standard that has not been toppled since, which is not bad for a kid from a little town in Texas. And if you thought Carroll Shelby was a genius of the racing world, I would like to introduce you to an innovator named Jim Hall. Hall was born in Abilene on July 23rd, 1935. He and his family did move quite a lot when he was younger, so he spent most of his childhood in Colorado and New Mexico. He was a very bright engineering student, and he attended the California Institute of Technology after high school. He was doing so good there, he was offered a job at GM to start working on the Corvette, and that was before he'd even graduated. But unfortunately, at the time he got his diploma, the job had disappeared. This is late 1950s, America's going through a recession, and it forced GM to cut back on its hiring spree. Hall never quite made it up there. So instead, he went back to Texas. His older brother, Dick, was working for a little operation called Carroll Shelby Sports Cars out in Dallas, which was Texas's biggest importer of European cars. To promote those cars, Shelby would tell Jim Hall to go take one out to the racetrack, drive it around, Hall would go win, and Shelby would use this as promotion. Obviously, if this rookie can get behind the wheel of this car and go win, clearly the car is amazing. Please come buy it. You can buy this exact one that he drove. Folks in the know knew that Jim Hall was the reason why that was so successful and why those cars were going so fast. And so he started to get offers to drive more and more cars in more and more disciplines. He even went and purchased his own Lotus, a Formula One Lotus, to compete in the 1960 United States Grand Prix at Riverside in California. He kept up with the best talents at the time, guys like Sterling Moss, Jim Clark, and Graham Hill. He was up in the points, which was the top 6 at this point in time, until a little component broke, dropped him to 7th. So still not bad. This catches the eye of a whole lot of people in the motorsport world, including 2 fellas named Dick Troutman and Tom Barnes. These men had been building cars for the Indy 500 for years, but were now trying to break into the sports car scene with this car here, the Riverside Racer. They just couldn't figure out how to actually make it good. It looked good. It should have been good. It wasn't. So they asked Jim Hall if he could help out. This leads Jim Hall to create a car company called Chaparral Cars, which he founds in Midland, Texas, with a fellow racer named Hap Sharp. Together, they took the car that Troutman and Barnes had started to build and transformed it into a race-winning machine that would be considered the first Chaparral car in history. When it comes to the development of motorsport technology, though, I don't think anyone in racing has been as prolific and forward-thinking as Jim Hall. And the wild part is that he's not been paid the recognition, I think, that he would deserve for that. Our understanding of what makes a race car good has evolved dramatically over the years. And in the 1960s, we were still kind of operating on this principle of, at least as far as the design of the body went, if it looks right, it is right. So you were getting sleek chassis, you were getting these sleek body cars. You thought maybe like they should slip through the air, but no one was doing the aerodynamic work and really studying that to understand how it was going. So it was kind of a free-for-all, and it was working for a lot of people. Even, Enzo Ferrari was making this, if it looks right, it is right concept work for him, and had been for years. But it can only take you so far. And for Jim Hall, he had learned all of these various technologies in his engineering career and began to apply them to to motorsport. He brought rigorously academic approaches to racing and testing. They have their own track out in Midland. They're taking these cars out for hours and hours, testing aerodynamics, the activity of the cars, the suspension loading. GM comes in to give them some funding because Jim Hall helped with the Corvair court cases that were going on at that time. The Chevy Corvair had been mysteriously getting into incidents where people were killed, and there was a push for. The argument was effectively that GM knew this was a problem and built those cars anyway. They gave the cars to Jim Hall at Chaparral, He proved effectively there was no design flaw that was intentional. It was just often that the folks behind the wheel were bad drivers. So he's got a little bit of this money, and he's able to start putting it into his own designs. The first car that Chaparral built was called the 2, and a later version of the 2 called the 2C featured one of the first rear wings in racing history. The wing could be controlled by the driver inside the car. They got rid of the clutch pedal entirely. They had automatic transmissions at this point, and they would use that pedal to move the angle of the wing. So as you went into the corner, you can move that wing in such a way that it would catch the air, shove that air down into the rear of the car, give you extra downforce, and help you go faster. The original 2 also featured a body built out of fiberglass, which was unheard of in a race car. Fiberglass is a composite, so it's made out of ultrafine glass fibers that are wound together and sealed with resin. Has a lot of benefits. It's lighter than even the lightest forms of metal they were using to construct cars. It's easier to mold into shape, and it's way more durable. And it also means you can build a monocoque chassis with it. You can build the whole entire car in one big piece that's nice and strong. And so with a 2H, that's what they're doing. Hall had spent time studying speedboats, so he knew composites, and that's where he gets this idea. But his wildest innovation has to be the 2J, one of my favorite cars, I think, in history. He pioneered something called ground effect in racing. Ground effect in motorsport is the opposite of what makes airplanes lift off. So ground effect will create a low pressure area underneath the car, which sucks the car down and gives you extra downforce. Hall achieved this by putting 2 fans at the back of the car. The fans would suck the air out from underneath the car. They obviously had to enclose the whole thing so that there would be a low pressure area, and the bottom was lined with Lexan, so kind of a form of plastic, so it was movable. When the car sucked to the earth, it would have a little lip that, could move with the car. This thing was insane. The drivers who drove it said it felt unreal. They could take corners without having to lift. It felt like they were floating. It terrified Jackie Stewart, who got a chance to race it at Watkins Glen. And the 2J was the first car to utilize this ground effect technology. But it doesn't get that credit because it was almost immediately banned. This car was competing in a series called the Canadian American Challenge Cup, or Can-Am. Can-Am's single rule was that there are no rules until Jim Hall starts showing up with things like the 2J, and all of the other manufacturers and competitors are realizing it's going to cost me a lot of money to build this kind of technology. If this car can finish a race, it's going to dominate everything. So Can-Am bans this car, succumbs to some pressure from the FIA, and the 2J, it's too forward-thinking to go anywhere else. You can't put this in the FIA Sports Car Championship. You can't put this in SCCA. So as a result, the concept of ground effect in motorsport would take a backseat for several years. As far as Jim Hull went, he was so disgusted by the banning of the 2J that he quit motorsport outright for 10 years. When he was finally convinced to come back, it was as a designer of a new open-wheel car for IndyCar, where he pioneered ground effect in a new discipline with a car called the 2K. So rather than using vacuums at this point in time, he created a car that had 2 long tunnels underneath of it. So when air passed through those tunnels, it would create that low pressure zone that would suck the car to the ground. If you're an F1 fan, this is the ground effect concept that they used in 2022 when they reintroduced ground effect. No one was really sure ground effect could even work on an oval at this point in time. Chaparral and Jim Hall proved it could. They took 13 total wins, including 2 Indy 500s. So to me, Jim Hall is probably like the most underrated man in motorsport history. I think he'd probably be too humble to agree with me, and that's probably exactly why no one remembers him to the extent that they should. If you're an F1 fan, like you've heard these stories of the British teams that introduced the monocoque chassis and ground effect, Lotus is a pioneer on these fronts, and they did introduce those technologies to F1, but generally they were not the first teams to introduce it to motorsport. That was probably coming from Jim Hall. We just mythologize ourselves, and the British love to do that in Formula One, so we end up remembering those as kind of being the inventors of the technology in racing. Jim Hall forced motorsport to get scientific. He forced it to get engineering. He forced everyone to actually start recording data and analyzing data and understanding how to take that data and use it to build a faster car. He is the reason why that happened. And if you're out in Midland, you can go to the Chaparral Museum, which is great. It's in the Permian Basin Petroleum Museum. And they do have all of the cars there, and every other month or so, they take one out and drive it around. They're all still in functioning condition. So you can go see them doing their thing, which is very cool. I've seen it before. It's pretty sick. There's probably no driver in racing history that more embodies a Texas spirit, though, than A.J. Foyt. Born Anthony Joseph Foyt Jr. in Houston in 1935 to a father who owned and raced dirt cars and wanted his son to stay out of the cockpit and become a mechanic instead, Foyt is known for his stubbornness. As legend has it, when he was 5 years old, he challenged the local track champion to a duel and won. We're talking a 5-year-old boy and a grown adult man. At that point, Foyt's father accepts, my son's going to become a race car driver, but he still wasn't exactly happy about it, particularly because A.J. Foyt kept getting caught by the police while street racing, and then he dropped out of high school to go focus on cars, and that was not his dad's plan for him. Thankfully, it turns out he's not too bad behind the wheel. So he starts off in dirt cars, but as his career evolved, he became one of the most versatile drivers in history. Today, most drivers are specialists. Formula One drivers generally stick in Formula One. It's a big, rare thing when Max Verstappen takes a sports car out at the Nürburgring. NASCAR drivers stick to NASCAR. A.J. Foyt was doing everything. He raced wherever he could. And we'll start with the Indy 500. Foyt debuted at the iconic race in 1958, and it would only take him 3 years to take his first win there. He would win the race again in 1964, 1967, and 1977, which would make him the first man in Indy 500 history to win the race 4 times. To this day, there have only been 3 others who have accomplished that feat, which is not too shabby considering this race has been around for 100 years. Foyt was also active in American Open Wheel as a championship. He won 7 USAC championships. He knew what he was doing, and while he was building his career, he was also dipping a toe into stock car racing. He would make his NASCAR debut in the Cup Series in 1963. He took 7 wins at the Cup level. His first one came in 1964 and his last in 72. He also won the Daytona 500 in 1972, which makes him one of only 2 drivers who have won the Indy 500 and the Daytona 500. The other guy is Mario Andretti. And then he had an endurance racing career that we can't forget about as well, where he'd compete behind the wheel of a sports car. We talked about Carroll Shelby, we talked about the Ford GT40 program, we talked about the win in 1966. Well, 1967, they have to go back and defend their crown. So Ford sends 4 different teams, and one team has 2 American drivers. They've got A.J. Foyt, and they have Dan Gurney. If you've seen Ford versus Ferrari, you know the drama of 66, but I think the 67 drama was even better. Because at the end of May 31st, A.J. Foyt crosses the finish line at the Indy 500 to win. By July 7th, he was in France, where he saw the Circuit de la Sarthe for the first time ever, behind the wheel of the GT40 for his first laps at speed. Sunday, he wins. He was the Rookie of the Year, as you can see by the little Goodyear plaque here, that they handcrafted. First rookie to win that wasn't the first year of Le Mans. And he never went back to Le Mans. He didn't need to. He proved what he did, and he was pretty good at it. But he did go to endurance racing in the United States. He won at the 24 Hours of Daytona and at the 12 Hours of Sebring. And if you show up at an IndyCar race today, you will probably still see A.J. Foyt. He's 91 years old, so no, he's not racing anymore, but he is the owner of the team called A.J. Foyt Enterprises. He founded that team in 1965 as a way to go racing on his own terms, and it has continued ever since. To me, A.J. Foyt is like the kind of racer you just don't get anymore. He he could fix his own cars, he could race his own cars, he could race and win in everything he chose to do. If Carroll Shelby showed the world what Texas engineers could accomplish, and Jim Hall showed what Texas innovators could invent, then A.J. Foyt demonstrated what a Texas racer could endure. His career has been defined by the grit, versatility, and determination that he learned as a kid growing up in Houston, and he is a legend to this day. Now, the Whittington brothers were not the most successful racers in Texas, also probably not the most ethical, but they may be some of the most notorious, and I think it's worth a mention just because of that. When Don and Bill Whittington burst on the motorsport scene in the late 1980s, no one had heard of them, specifically here in Texas, where they were from. They're born in Lubbock. But suddenly they're racing on some of motorsport's biggest stages, including the 1979 24 Hours of Le Mans. That year, the brothers basically bought their way into a race team. It was the Kramer Racing Porsche 935 K3, alongside an experienced German driver named Klaus Ludwig. The team owner is the guy who's in charge of deciding when the drivers are going to race and when they're going to get behind the wheel. And the Whittington brothers did not like the order he'd selected. They wanted to start the race. He did not have them starting. They didn't want to race at night. He had them racing at night. The boss joked, if the brothers are going to buy the car, then they can do whatever they want. They can decide when they're going to race. He joked that it would cost them $200,000 to do it, which was way, way, way more than that car was actually worth. Next thing he knows, that team boss is being handed a suitcase with $200,000 in cash stuffed into it. That was not even the bulk of the money that the Whittingtons had brought over to France with them that year, because they spent the rest of it buying more race cars, and they won. After that, it seemed like there were Whittingtons everywhere you looked. They were both competing in Indy 500s. They were in NASCAR races. They bought the Road Atlanta racetrack in Georgia. Bill Whittington even formed his own race team with a fellow named Randy Lanier that they called Blue Thunder Racing. And in 1986, they disappeared. The reason Don and Bill Whittington could afford to basically buy the Porsche team with bags full of cash is the exact reason why their career ended. In the late 1980s, both brothers were arrested under charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to smuggle marijuana. Yeah, that is correct. Both brothers were involved in a drug smuggling operation in which they smuggled untold amounts of weed from Colombia into the United States to sell it for untold amounts of money. And when you have literal heaps of cash laying around, you're going to spend it on your goofiest hobbies. So racing, they also really loved military planes, so they would buy and restore old military planes. The wild part is that they were not even the only ones in racing at this point in time to be involved in drug smuggling. Randy Lanier, the fellow that they formed their Blue Thunder Racing team with, was one such man, as was John Paul Sr. and Jr., a father-son duo. All of them were either suspected or convicted of having smuggled money. John Paul Sr. just disappeared. We don't know where he went. Everyone else did jail time. Don Whittington is still alive today. He operates a fixed base operator called WorldJet out of the Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. Bill, unfortunately, passed away in 2012. He crashed a plane outside of Winslow, Arizona. Again, I can't say they're the most ethical drivers from Texas, but they are some of the most interesting, and they are part of this wild crossover between true crime and racing that I think, what a good story. Absolutely incredible. So we've talked a lot about racers here, but I want to talk about a man named Andy Granatelli for a minute. Born in March of 1923 in Dallas before his family moved to Chicago, Granatelli is best known as being the CEO of STP, the lubrication company. His contribution to motorsport extended way beyond that role because he just reinvented motorsport sponsorship in the 1960s, 50s, and 70s. He got his start as a Ford mechanic and a speed shop entrepreneur. He started to promote racing events after World War II, and then he signed on with STP. In 1961, he was made head of marketing, and his basic first goal was get people to know what STP is, make them recognize the logo. So he did an ingenious thing where he would create hundreds and thousands of stickers and just hand them out. So kids all across America had STP stickers on their bicycles and their lunch boxes. They were getting stuck on telephone poles and on windows. So people started to know what this company was. Granatelli starts to appear in TV commercials, and he also started to sponsor drivers competing for world land speed records at the Bonneville Salt Flats. He sponsored cars and drivers that broke that record over 400 times. Now, it didn't take him too long before he decided he was going to go to the Indy 500, and he had a penchant for sponsoring some of the best teams with their cutting-edge technology. He started out with Novi racers, who were kind of an underdog at this time when compared to the Offenhauser Might with their supercharged V8 engines. In the late 60s, Granatelli sponsored the construction, development, and running of a car powered by a jet turbine engine and all-wheel drive. It was unthinkable at the time, and it very nearly won the race if it wasn't for a parts failure. That was, I believe it was like a $5 part. He did win the race with Mario Andretti in 1969. That was Mario Andretti's first and only 500 win. Legend has it this kiss also left the Andretti family with bad luck through the rest of Indy 500 history because he wasn't kissed by the woman who was going to present him with the trophy. He would win it again in 1973, and as you can tell by the STP-laden overalls, Granatelli wanted you to know who was paying for this. In 1970, Granatelli started to sponsor Formula One cars. He went to the March team, got the cars painted red with the distinctive STP logos, and in NASCAR, he forged a partnership with Richard Petty that is probably the most recognizable driver-sponsor duo, like to this day. Granatelli did leave STP in 1973. The belief is that it's probably to do with the fact that he was spending $20 million a year on sponsorship for race car, which is the equivalent of $160 million a year today. But it'd be impossible to find anyone who had this level of influence on motorsport sponsorship. He completely redefined what this meant. In the 1950s and 60s, sponsorship had only just started to really evolve, and it primarily consisted of a parts supplier giving you like tires or lubricants to compete in a race. You usually weren't getting money. If you were, it was a little bit. And they certainly weren't spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to make your jet-powered car work for the Indy 500. But Granatelli saw that there was potential for someone to take that on. He knew how to draw eyes and dollars, and he used that skill to fund a whole slew of incredible talents. We cannot know what racing would have looked like without him. Now, Johnny Rutherford, he was not born in Texas, but his family did settle in the Fort Worth area when he was very young, and that is where he forged his racing career. It's also what earned him the nickname Lone Star Jr. So he's born in 1938, and Rutherford today still remains an active part of American motorsport. Obviously, he's no longer driving, but he is probably one of the best ambassadors that American open wheel racing could have, which is great for a sport that loves tearing itself apart. Rutherford started out by driving modified stock cars in Dallas in 1959, and by 1961, he was competing all across America. He actually had some of his biggest early successes in NASCAR, even though we do think of him often today as an IndyCar driver. In 1963, he debuted at the Daytona heat races ahead of the Daytona 500. These races were part of the calendar. They were points-paying events, and he won his first ever heat race. That made him I think the sixth driver in all of history in NASCAR to win his debut NASCAR race. That same year, he got started in IndyCar. He debuted at the 1963 Indy 500 and took his first win later in that year. But there were fears his career was going to be over before it even got started. In 1966, Rutherford had a massive crash at the Eldora Speedway where his car literally flipped outside of the track fencing. His arms escaped the cockpit, and he broke both of them. He also took a serious blow to the head. He had to sit out the remainder of 1966. He underwent 7 different surgeries on his arms, and he went through so many infections that he had lost count. He was ready to come back to racing pretty soon after, but there was now this fear that he was damaged goods, especially with that blow to the head. But someone finally took a chance on him in 1970, 4 years after his crash, and he repaid their belief in him by getting ever more successful. If there was also a benefit of his wreck, it was that sprint cars, they were designing arm restraints now to keep the arms from going out of the cockpit and keeping them inside so this wouldn't happen again. Over the course of his career, Rutherford won the USAC Championship and the CART Championship. He's one of only 6 drivers to have won the Indy 500 3 times, which he did in 74, 76, and 1980. He also made 35 starts in the Cup Series, and that debut win that I mentioned at Daytona, well, in 1963, he held that record as the last rookie to win in his debut until 2023, when a gentleman named Shane Van Gisbergen from the Australian Supercar Series came over and dominated the 2023 Chicago Straight Race. Rutherford continued in racing until 1994, but his impact has never dimmed. He has taken on tons and tons of different roles, whether that's being a driver analyst on broadcasts, a pace car driver, a driver coach, a team ambassador for the revival of Arrow McLaren, a racing consultant, a steward. He was one of the guys that helped kind of reunify the sport when it was tearing itself apart. And because of that, he's become a kind of an unofficial ambassador of IndyCar. So he's been to the White House countless times to speak up about IndyCar. He's been praised for his way with words. He's also a really good artist. He painted the 2021 Indy 500 program. It is gorgeous. There's actually also another fun little tidbit about Rutherford and his impact on racing. So in 1963, when he debuts at Indy, he meets a nurse at the track. Her name is Betty. They get married 2 months later, and they were inseparable. Absolutely, he took her everywhere. Women, however, were banned from the garage and the pit lane at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. They were considered both a distraction and bad luck. Johnny Rutherford insisted his wife be on his pit box, and her presence there in 1974 when he took victory at the Indy 500 was one of the first steps toward dispelling this myth that women were bad luck at Indy. And now we really pivot to our NASCAR boys, Terry and Bobby Labonte, one of the most iconic sibling duos in all of American motorsport, and one of only 2 pairs of brothers who have won Cup championships. They also happen to hail from Corpus Christi, Texas. Terry, who very quickly earned the nickname Texas Terry, is the eldest of the 2. He was born in November of 1956 and started racing as a kid because his dad was working on his friend's hobby race cars. At 7 years old, he was racing in a small dirt car called a quarter midget and won a national championship 2 years later. As a teenager, he won track championships in Corpus Christi, Houston, and San Antonio. So obviously this does not go unnoticed. People know he's a good driver. And he caught the eye of a businessman from Louisiana named Billy Hagan. 1978, Billy Hagan pays for Terry Labonte to take his first Cup Series debut. He raced 5 races of the 30 that were taking place that season. He finished in the top 10 3 times. That convinces him, you've got some talent. 1979, Labonte and Hagan went full-time in the Cup Series, which meant that they were eligible for Rookie of the Year honors. They almost got there had it not been for a gentleman that you may have heard of called Dale Earnhardt. But clearly, Terry had a very bright future ahead of him. He won his first race in 1980, and he would go on to win a Cup championship in 1984. He would continue racing, but wouldn't take another Cup championship until 1992. So that 12-year gap is the longest drought in wins between 2 championships for any driver in all of NASCAR history. He also won the 1989 IROC Championship, so the International Race of Champions. They would have the same kind of cars for drivers from all disciplines to get in and race. He wins that. He was also named on NASCAR's 75 Best Drivers in 2023. Bobby Labonte, his younger brother, was born in 1964. So 7 years after his elder brother was born. And at this point, Terry's already racing. Terry's on his way to his first championships. Obviously, Bobby wants to go racing too. He started competing in 1969 when he was 5 years old. He won his first feature race when he was 6, and he really skyrocketed through the ranks, kind of taking advantage of his brother's success. Everyone thought if one Labanti's good, the second clearly must be better. He made his Cup Series debut in 1980, and then things didn't really go well for him at the top level. He was quite young, so still in high school, I believe, at this point in time. So he stepped back from active competition and became a fabricator for Terry's cars. After a little while, he was ready to dip his toe back into the racing world. And when he got there, he found his footing. Over the course of his career, Bobby Labanti won 21 races and also won the 2000 Cup Series championship. 1 year later, he also won the IROC championship in 2001 and was in 2023 also named one of NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers. Raising just one good competitive driver is a hard enough task as it is, let alone two. But the Labonte family did it. Obviously, the Bush family is the only other one, with Kurt and Kyle both having taken championships. But the fact that I think the Labonte brothers came from Corpus Christi, which we don't really know as a racing town, kind of makes that more impressive. And our last gentleman here today, the only active driver here. If you have bought a car in Texas in the last decade, there is a pretty good chance you bought it from a man named Ben Keating. Keating is the head of the Keating Auto Group, which is the largest privately held auto group in Texas, 15th largest in all of the United States. And that is still his career, but it was what he was doing before he found motorsport. Keating was born in Tomball, Texas in 1971. He grew up washing and parking cars at a Ford dealership. In college, he interned with a service group. He took over a role as a used car sales manager at his dad's dealership, and then in 2002, bought a dealership. He's been amassing more dealerships ever since. He also forged a career in racing because in 2007, his wife got him a wonderful Christmas present. It was a weekend track driving course. So he learned how to drive kind of a standard car on a legitimate racetrack, and he loved it so much, he thought, maybe I could find a way to do this more often. He started out in the Dodge Viper Cup, won that championship in 2011, and he has been competing ever since in European and American sports car championships. He won the 2021 IMSA championship in the LMP2 category. He was a two-time LMGTE AM champion in the World Endurance Championship in 2022 and 2023, and he's also a three-time class winner at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, including this year. Ben Keating is basically like what they would call a gentleman driver, which were much more common back in the day. Basically, gentleman driver is an amateur driver who has the money to be able to afford to go racing and to compete in big events. They still can get paid, they can still win. Not everyone loves the concept of a gentleman driver. They often have more money than sense or skill. But Ben Keating has been an outlier on that front. He has legitimately established himself as a fantastic member of the motorsport community, and he represents the fine folks of Texas very well. But that's all from me. I want to thank you guys so much for coming. If you're interested, I do have more talks coming up.